Welcome to another session of our In Conversation live series. Today we have with us Dr. Alok Sarin, who is a very well-renowned psychiatrist across India, and also he's a very well-respected voice in the mental health space. And he has also appeared in the media quite frequently for his invaluable insights. Welcome, Dr. Sarin.
Sakshi, your voice is gone, and I think you're muted.
Yes, sorry. So today we have in conversation with us Dr. Alok Sarin, very well-known psychiatrist across India. Dr. Alok Sarin has played a very major role in the COVID-19 Stress Management Committee at the hospital, and he continues to play a very important role in terms of guiding many patients and staff members across the hospital in terms of the post-COVID mental health management initiatives. Dr. Sareen, we're very glad that you are here with us today. We're going to cover a very important topic in terms of, which will go to address all of those people who have lost many of their family members during the second wave of the pandemic. As we know, it's caused a lot of destruction, a lot of devastation, and many lives have been lost. And while in the media these might just be numbers, they're actually obviously they mean a lot more than that to each of those people who've actually lost their family members. So keeping that in mind, Dr. Sareen, if we were to talk about the process of grieving, so when people are actually grieving the loss of a family member, it is something that is very deep, very personal to them. That alone in itself is very difficult to handle. But if you then couple that along with a lot of other factors such as uncertainty, fear, helplessness, anxiety, in the middle of this entire pandemic, and we're now expecting a third wave also. So, I mean, it's very uncertain. There are many other stressors as well. So, how do you suggest that someone who is currently grieving the loss of a family member and also facing all of these multiple stressors, how do you suggest that they sort of embrace the situation?
So, there's no one formulaic way in which this can be answered, and uh, and there is no one answer, nor can there be. I think if we are to talk about this, then we have to start with an understanding, or a sort of a larger understanding of what it was that was happening, let us say, in the second wave, uh, in those brutal couple of months, which April, May uh, were pretty much across the length and breadth of the country. So, what was happening was that the number of infections had spread uh, to a very large extent, and they had exposed, in a sense, the vulnerabilities of the uh, not just the healthcare systems, but the systems of governance. So the fact that the infections were many, the fact that ill people were many, and the fact that deaths were many is obvious. But what was also different about this time was that many people found it difficult or even impossible to seek help. So, getting a hospital bed, getting an oxygen cylinder, getting an oxygen concentrator. In fact, I don't think most people, most lay people, hadn't even heard about things like oxygen concentrators till now. But suddenly, uh, everybody or every second family seemed to be looking for either beds or oxygen cylinders or oxygen concentrators. Forget the fact that plasma was unavailable and remdesivir was unavailable. Uh, it's debatable as to whether plasma or remdesivir actually have helped or not, but merely the fact that accessing any of this became such a very difficult proposition is what, in a sense, defined this. And what this did then was to create both a sense of anxiety, a sense of desperation, a sense of helplessness, a sense of being, totally powerless to cope with the situation. Grieving is a very difficult uh, process in any circumstance. Loss, the coping with that loss, and the coping with the loss of bereavement is is layered and textured and complex in any case. If over and above this comes this feeling of desperation and helplessness, then it just makes that grieving that much more complicated. So the fact that, you know any any understanding of the process of grief has to begin perhaps by an understanding of what it is that people were going through at that time. And it's not other people, you know it's not far away. It is all of us. It is you, it is me, it is our friends, it is our relatives, it is people who are calling us because we work in hospitals for, you know producing the impossible, for producing out of nowhere the bed in the hospital, which at that time was uh, nebulous and absent. It had got so completely overwhelmed the system, and not just the health system, the governance system, every system seemed to be uh, seemed to be so obvious in its absence that those silences were deafening. And that is what made the grieving process so much more complicated. If somebody dies, let us say at the age of 80, uh, surrounded by loved ones, having lived a full life, there is a sense of inevitability to this. There is a sense of closure which this is associated with this. If somebody dies because we are unable to organize a hospital bed, or if somebody dies because they are gasping for breath in the parking lot of a hospital, then we can only begin to understand what it is that those families are going through, what it is that those families will deal with. And that is what has made this so much more complicated. So the fact that all of this was happening is something that all of us have been both witness to and in many ways subject to as well. Now the question is, how how do we help to deal with these griefs? How do we come to terms with this? How do we try and work through this? And obviously, with something as complex as this, there can be no simple 3 point answers. The answers will be in many ways in different dimensions, both in terms of what it is personally that I can do, what it is that I can do in a larger sense, what it is that I can do to help other people deal with these griefs, what it is that I can do to help society deal with these griefs. And my sense is that this is a trauma which is as societal as it is individual. That this is something that has affected both the the person who has experienced it and all the people around him or her as well. And in so many ways, unless we think of the solutions also in in the same way, it is that yes, I need to see what I can do for myself, but more importantly, I need to see what I can do for the other. And in that awareness of the grief of the other, not only will I help the other, but I will perhaps help myself as well. So, specifically, what do I need to do? And I think a variety of things. I think that the stories need to be told. I think the stories, more importantly, need to be listened to. So, in those telling of the stories and the hearing of those stories, perhaps there will be some resolution. And this is, in a sense, what therapy is all about, what psychotherapy is all about, is the sharing of the nature of the distress, that making it clear to the individual that I am not alone, that he or she is not alone. And in that reaching out, both the hearer and the speaker are benefited. So I think perhaps we need to start thinking larger. I need to take care of myself. I, I need to make sure that I'm sleeping all right, that I'm insulating myself, that I'm exercising, that unless I'm okay, I will not be able to deal with the others. But only looking at myself or only looking after myself is perhaps not where the answers are. I need to be able to both look after myself and look after the other as well.
All right. Sir, I think you answered that quite well. I think you covered a lot of different points that need to be brought out and need to be talked about. For example, when you were talking about the shortage of beds and oxygen cylinders, I could sort of just reimagine all of that in my head. It was definitely something that I hope none of us ever have to go through again. So you talked about about people, about how they should maybe reach out to psychotherapists, to psychologists, to counselors in terms of sort of helping to sort of maybe grieve. So with respect to that, let's say that, and you also very well said that there is no one specific, it's not like a one size fits all kind of a approach. It is very individualistic. It is, it is going to be different for everyone. But from that point of view, if we would say, for someone who is in the grieving stage, who is currently still grieving, maybe they haven't really decided to reach out to someone as yet. Is there anything else that you would like to guide them about, as they go through this?
So, uh, so actually, I didn't say that people should reach out to therapists. Uh, it it would be useful to reach out to therapists, but I think that in a sense, all of us need to become those therapists. I think that all of us need to start both telling those stories and listening to those stories. I think that the process of therapy needs to happen. Yes, some people will definitely benefit from visiting a mental health professional, whether it is a therapist or a psychiatrist. But it's not as if everybody in our society or everybody who is troubled or upset or grieving or who is bereaved needs to necessarily seek professional help. No, that is not what I'm suggesting. I think that if all of us as individuals, and I speak of myself here not as a mental health professional, but as an individual citizen of, let us say, of, of the city, of the country, of the nation, of society, if as an individual who is part of that society, if I listen to those stories, if all of us listen to those stories and listen to those stories with with empathy, with respect, with compassion. If I share in the grief of my neighbor, if I, by the sharing of that grief, I diminish that grief, then this is what the process of therapy is. So I think that perhaps all of us need to be able to reach out and look for and in fact create those solutions. Uh, Societal grief, in a sense, needs societal healing. Societal grief needs societal redressal. What has happened is that there is a, a huge trauma that has happened. There is a huge blow that all of us have experienced. And in some ways, and in many ways, for that healing process to happen, we need to figure out how we can help both ourselves and societies to heal. For which I think we all need to be able to reach out to the people who are suffering, and in that process, not only will we help the people who are experiencing the grief, but we will help ourselves. We are as much members of that society. You see, in some ways, what it has taken a pandemic to teach us or to remind us, because it's not that any of this is new. The fact that we are all parts of the whole, we've always known, we've prepared lip service to this without seriously thinking too much about this. It is it is these things which bring those realities clear, that the health of society actually depends upon the health of the most vulnerable. It is the that if I need society to be better, if I need society to be healthier, more sort of, you know, alive on its feet, then I need to take care of the people who are suffering the most. And at this time, and so normally it would be times when social inequity is worst, when the underprivileged are the worst. At this time, it has taken something like this to teach us that there is no other, that we are the other. that we are the people who are suffering. And if we are able to step out of this othering mode and try and understand what each of us is going through and help each other along, then maybe that redemption for society will happen again.
All right, so I think again that was actually something that I was going to ask you about in terms of how we can help one another, but I guess you already answered that. But so if we sort of maybe extend that towards like say like reaching out to our friends and family and them sharing their stories with us, if we sort of extend that to the workplace, are there any specific, tips or guidelines that you could maybe share for all of us who are, who might come in contact with many of our colleagues who might have gone through something similar, and who might want to talk, but maybe they're not completely comfortable with talking. From that point of view, is there anything that you would suggest in terms of how we could then approach those kind of situations?
So, you know, when it again, one of the things that uh, the pandemic has reminded us of, and they're almost they're like paradoxical things. The one thing that happens is that in this fear of infection, we tend to close ourselves in. We tend to lock ourselves into a house. I mean, this is what lockdown is, of minimizing contact, of minimizing uh, engagement. And so I tend to think small. I tend to think of myself, my immediate family, and lock myself uh, in exclusion of the world. While what is happening is actually the very opposite. What is something that has happened far away is affecting my well-being. The fact that infection or infectivity spreads uh, in distant places affects me, it becomes clearer to me that only thinking about myself or the four people who surround me is far too limiting and limited a way of thinking. That unless my my community is healthy, there's no way that I am going to be healthy. Unless my society is healthy, there is no way that I'm going to be healthy. I can vaccinate myself, but we know that while vaccination helps, only vaccination is not a solution. That unless the larger society is healthy, I am not going to be okay. So my well-being depends on the well-being of others. So while the anxiety about the infection is nudging me to think small, what I need to do is to think larger. So when it comes to the workplace, when it comes to larger workplaces, we know what, let us say that we accept the fact that, that the lockdown is necessary to contain the infection, contain the spread. But the fact that this has, in many ways, so many negative consequences, I also need to be aware of. And let's, for the moment, forget about the economic consequences. We forget how much we are all dependent on social connectedness, on on being with people. In grieving, for example, the one of the main ways in which we deal with grief is sharing our grief with others. You know, every human society, every community, every religion, every group of human beings has collective rituals for grief. People gather, they talk about what it is that has happened, they share those, they relive those experiences, and in some ways they work through it. The pandemic has taken that away, because that social connectivity, that social congregation, that social collection cannot happen at this point of time. And so the very tools that I need at this point of time are unavailable. You know, it's like that mythical, uh, like the Brahmastra, कि ये आपके पास ये अस्त्र है और ये किसी भी लड़ाई में आपकी मदद करेगा। पर प्रॉब्लम सिर्फ इतनी सी है कि जब आपको ज़रूरत होगी तब आप इसको इस्तेमाल नहीं कर सकते हैं। तो आज जब मुझे इसकी सबसे ज़्यादा ज़रूरत है उस सोशल कनेक्टिविटी की, वो सोशल कनेक्टिविटी मैं इस्तेमाल नहीं कर सकता। सो वी हैव टू फाइंड वेज अराउंड इट। We have to see how we can connect, and this holds as much true of the workplace or of the diverse workplaces. So, understanding, so we work, you and I work in a hospital. It, to my, embarrassment and shame, in all these meetings and all these COVID conversations that we've been having, we've been talking about how difficult it has been for for doctors and nurses and the cleaning staff. And I never thought for a moment how difficult it would have been for the telephone operators. Now, the telephone operator is the first point of contact for anybody who is trying to get in touch with the hospital. And in those, brutal 6 or 8 weeks, the amount of calls that they would have received, the amount of beseeching calls that they would have received, the amount of upset, angry, abusive calls that they would have received, we, we haven't even thought about it. So, in if we are to look at the workplace, then I have to, in a sense, stop thinking about myself and start thinking about what it is that other people are going through, have gone through. How do I reach out to them? And this holds true not only for the workplace, for society. You know, that unless I am able to put myself in the place of the other person, uh, society will not heal. And desperately, I think we need that healing to take place.
All right, sir. Yes, like you said, the telephone exchange, I think I completely agree with you there. I mean, I agree with all of the other things that you said as well. But yes, like you said, they were definitely the first point of contact when they were getting all of these SOS calls in a way. So it must have definitely been a lot more harder than we can actually imagine. Sir, actually now again, since we're talking about the workplace and talking about say telephone exchange in the context of healthcare workers in general, there is another question that comes up in the sense of as healthcare workers, both clinical as well as non-clinical. I think all of us have really been approached for say for maybe a bed in the hospital or even oxygen cylinders, remdesivir injections and everything. So from that point of view, while we did what we could in terms of trying our best to help our family and friends, there have been colleagues, there have been staff members who have lost family members, and for them, it's somewhat difficult to sort of get over the feeling of guilt that they could not do much, or that maybe they could have done a lot more than they actually did. So, in that kind of a situation, how do you suggest someone actually try to get or try to just overcome this feeling of helplessness?
So my sense is that it's not some, it's all. I don't think there is a single person who was able to uh, answered all the requests, uh, and honored the requests that came to him or her. There is not, there is perhaps not a single person today. Uh, the nature of the devastation, the size and the scope of the devastation was so large, so profound, and so engulfing that all of us are in the same boat. Yes, some have lost family members, some may not have lost family members, but I think pretty much everybody will be feeling both that, what is, in a term called survivor guilt. He Why did, you know the other person die, or why did the other person lose a family member and not me? Why was I not able to help enough? And the fact is that there is no answer. There is no logical answer to this, and nor can there be. But the point is that for most grief is not answered with, in that sense, with cold, emotionless logic. Grief is shared. Grief is understood. Grief is honored, and grief is honored by that sharing, by the telling of that story, by my listening to that story, by my respecting the grief. The person who is experiencing that grief is able to come to some sort of terms with that. The answers, as we all know, lie largely within. And here, none of us are immune to this. In the seeking to help, we are also seeking our own redemptions. And in that, and that is what societal healing is. In the healing of self lies the healing of society, and in the healing of society lies the healing of self. So, unless we recognize and honor the the suffering of the other, I will not be able to, acknowledge, and because the suffering of the other is the suffering of self. We've it it actually has take, and this is true in all circumstances, but it has taken the pandemic to remind us how true this is, because here we are all the sufferers. They, you know in the first wave of the pandemic, there was a lockdown, and it was very different from the lockdown of the second wave. We all saw migrant workers, and we felt very sorry, and uh, we did what we could. We collected money, we collected food, we collected rations, we distributed those rations. You know, we did, and we felt very good about it. But, and there's a big but, we looked at them as the other. We looked at them, and we felt good about the fact that we saw people suffering, and we felt bad for their suffering, but it was not our suffering. It was the middle class, the privileged, stepping in to help the underprivileged. And this is a good thing. There's no argument about it. Of course they should. But it was through the lenses of distance. Here, in the second wave, it was us. There was no distancing. There's no single. I doubt that there is a single person, at least let us say in Delhi, who does not know either closely or very closely or very 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 closely somebody who has died or suffered or who has been through those agonizing uh, hours and days of helplessness and frustration. So we are all in this together. It has taken us this to remind us that we are all in this together. So if we don't deal with this sort of thing, and if we don't wake up to this now, I mean, when is it that we are going to realize these things?
That's true, sir. Sir, you also mentioned, you compare the second wave to the first wave. And so, with respect to that, actually, are there any maybe key concerns that you saw emerge now with the second wave compared to the first wave? Maybe, some things maybe that you hadn't heard of or seen in the first wave.
So extent of the the infections, the extent of the damage, the morbidity, and the things to realize that there are metrics there. So there was a infection, there was a time when the hospitalization was needed, when the oxygen was needed, and the medication was needed, and the beds were needed. There was a time when all of this was not available, and then there was a delayed metric. The the deaths, the mortality appeared later, and then there is an even more delayed metric, which is the mental health impact. Which so the brutality of the second wave, shall we say, seemed to settle around May, uh, when the infection, the numbers started dropping, the pressure on beds and oxygen decreased. The death figures became apparent uh, later because the people who were really sick continued to be really sick for some time, and then you know many didn't make it. So the mortality was in that sense a delayed metric. The mental health impact is an even more delayed metric. So now it is now that we are experiencing and seeing all those people uh, who went through that really difficult time and who are now finding it difficult, finding the process of grieving difficult, the expressing what they've been through difficult, the sharing difficult. And this is the time I think that all of us need to step in and reach out to each other and and help in that process of healing and sharing.
All right, sir. So, like you said, now and before, in the previous question about how we're all in this together, I mean, I completely agree with that as well. Now, from that perspective, as we prepare for the third wave, is there anything else that you would suggest that we keep in mind to prepare ourselves both mentally as well as physically?
So it's a complicated uh, call in the sense that you know so this brings us back to the earlier thing that the more anxious I get, the smaller becomes my thinking. And in a sense, what is needed is larger thinking, which doesn't mean that that I start organizing uh, 1,500 people weddings uh, or religious gatherings. No, so So not in that sense. So how do I, while maintaining those precautions, start thinking bigger? So So the answer to your question will be at one level, of course, doing what perhaps in some ways is being done, making sure that that health infrastructure is there, making sure that the beds are available, making sure, more importantly, that those access pathways, uh, which were so obvious by their absence the last time, that those are made available. That if there is a need, then where do I go? Uh, what is the available facility? Rather than panicky midnight calls. Uh, if there is a system, so those systems need to be in place. But those systems, in a sense, are the responsibility of the state. And the state is, as we know, working uh, towards this, and hopefully will have, uh, you know, at least done some bits of this. And so, in that sense, it will not be as devastating or as brutal as the last time around was. As an individual, what do I do? As an individual, while maintaining those precautions, you see, unlike what happened in the second wave, the fact of the matter is that disaster will will take all existing fault lines and make them deeper and broader and wider. So if there is social inequity, then disaster will make it much worse. If there is, let us say, communal tension, the fact that disaster will make it much worse. If there is economic vulnerability, disaster will make it much worse. And this may not be necessarily restricted to what we call the first wave or the second wave or the third wave. These are persistent, the long term effects. And these are in so many ways as damaging as the waves in and of themselves. The, and so is the mental health impact. So maybe I need to start thinking in those terms as to how, because we are clear that we're all in this together. And if if the most vulnerable is the benchmark of the health of society as it should be, then the in a large sense the preparation of the fallout of the third or the fourth or the sixth wave would be, how do I help the disadvantaged? And if I can do that, then not only will I reduce the impact in many ways, in the long term impact, but I may actually alter the wave itself, because those societies which are in equipoise will be relatively more buttressed against the impact of the virus, of the pandemic.
All right, sir. Sir, I think all of those answers were quite well received. I think you covered many different aspects. We will be taking up audience questions now. So for our viewers, if you have not left us a question yet, please go ahead and do so now. We'll be taking them up during the session, and in case we're not able to, we will definitely get back to you by the end of the day. So there is a question from Shubham. He says, in your opinion, how has the pandemic affected children's mental health? Considering they are not able to express themselves, are there any specific signs parents or family members should watch out for before getting help?
So in in many ways, this is the first time that uh, that anybody in their memory is seeing anything like this. And the fact that the fact that it's very large. Uh, the If adults need socialization, then children need socialization even more. And, and we all know how large a role uh, school and the social activity of school plays in the psychological development of children. And all of that has been, for the last year and a half, completely, conspicuously absent. In some places, the families have been able to take care of it, but we must remember that not all families are either able or supportive or privileged enough to be able to do this. So, in many ways, the effects of that would be, in many situations, the effects of that would be damaging. So, in a general manner, if we see many and different changes in behavior, changes in the way that the child is dealing with the world, then it should it should perhaps uh, trigger off some warning bells, and looking at help, looking at the at least the greater understanding of this. So it doesn't mean that the all the children who uh, become quieter or more withdrawn or more irritable, or or who are not being able to study, doesn't mean that all of them should be put on antidepressant medicine. Certainly not. But the fact that we need to pay attention to what is going on, the fact that we need to be aware and cognizant of what is going on, and figure out the ways in which we can help is certainly, I think, necessary. We need to be we need to be sensitive to those changes and see in what ways we can help. In many cases, it might just be that the solution is spending more time with the child. In many situations, it might be that, as and when schools open up, the going back to school might help. So the answers will be different. The answers will be as varied as the different trajectories of the children. But I need to be aware and sensitive to these things.
All right, sir. So there is another question about from Amrita. She says, "I have noticed a change in my friend's behavior. He has become very reserved compared to his happy-go-lucky nature prior to the pandemic. How can I help him?"
I don't know, but I think that the way a possible way would be to be able to listen to him, to try and understand what is bringing about this change, to be, while respectful of the change, uh, to be available if he does want to speak about it. And in many situations, the sharing of what uh, that individual is going through in itself is the therapeutic intervention that is required. So be available, listen, hear, and I think it will help. In fact, I think that what society needs at this time is for all of us to be more available to each other.
Yes, definitely, sir. Sir, there is a question from Megha. She says, in the cases where one has lost family back to back, how does one avoid becoming irrationally anxious about the remainder of their family? How do you counter this anxiety and also downstream behavior?
So this is a very good question, and it opens up so many things. So in a sense, in at one level, if if somebody has lost not one but more than one family members, then the fear of losing other family members, is that fear rational or irrational? And in my thinking, it would be perhaps I mean, it would be difficult not to say that this is a rational fear. It is a reasonable fear. So, so the first thing is that, when we talk about fears and anxieties, the fact of the matter is that all fears and anxieties don't necessarily need to be labeled irrational. Many of them are real. So, the what a person who is going through, who has lost not one but more than one family members, is grieving, and for that person to be fearful of further loss is natural. And for that person to come to terms with that, not only has does that person need to see this as natural, but I, as somebody who helps him, should be able to see this as natural. That this is a natural response to trauma, to bereavement, to grief, and that this will need working through. And what is that working through? That working through is to be able to talk to somebody about it, and it could be a friend, it could be a confidant, it could be a family member, it could be a therapist, but to have that sharing, listening space. And for Megha to be able to be sympathetic in her thinking, in her listening, and in her sharing is is the solution which that individual needs. And in this process will then determine outcome. That the more I am able to resolve these things, these issues, these traumas, the more I will be able to deal with the world in its entirety tomorrow. But today, it's what is needed is healing, and for that healing, I need to be able to listen to that person with empathy and with compassion.
All right. So there is another question from Prashant. Again, an important question, something that a lot of people again might be facing. So he says, how do you address the queries of children, or in general help children who are affected with the loss of parents and grandparents? Since I mean, children are fragile in that sense, they don't really understand too much. How would you suggest? What would you suggest for someone in this kind of?
So the answer is in many different ways. One is, uh, can state and society do something about it? And the answer is yes, of course they can. And of course, in some ways, in small and real ways, state and society are talking about it. We can argue forever that is enough being done or enough not being done, but that's a different argument in in and of itself. What is it that I can do? And what is it that I can do actually, you know, brings me back to one of my favorite stories, which is, you know, uh, so I'm a psychiatrist. I work with people with mental illness, but more importantly for the moment, I am interested in history and I'm interested in the history of psychiatry. And so we are looking at the history of the mental hospitals. In one of those histories, in 1930, there is a superintendent of a mental hospital in Ranchi called Dr. Dhunji Boy. So Dhunji Boy writes in 1930 that what is needed to help the person with the mental affliction is to be able to stand beside that person and alongside him in his difficulties. And in a sense, this is true of the human experience. This was written almost 100 years ago. 8 years, 9 years short of 100. It will be, I mean, it is now, and in 2030 it will be 100 years. But it is as true then as it is now. So, what is it that I can do when I am with a person who is who has experienced what could be called a huge, a very large, overwhelming trauma, loss of loss of a parent, sometimes loss of both parents. What is it that I can say? And in a sense, there's nothing really that I can say. What is it that I need to do? What I need to do is what Dhunji Boy said in 1930. I need to be able to stand alongside that individual, that child, and in the sharing, in that standing alongside, in that expression of humanity, I hopefully will be able to help. I can't bring his parents back. There is no way. Nobody can. But there is still a lot that I can do to help. And in that standing alongside is where at least some of those answers will lie. So I will stand alongside, I will listen to what the child has to say. I may not say much, I may not have much to say, but that listening is that powerful tool.
Right, so listening and also just being there, like you said, is something that can be reassuring and comforting as well. So there is a question from Lipakshi. She says, "How to relax your mind when there is negativity all around due to loss? Any tips or suggestions for that?"
So, so we've been talking about uh, uh, listening and being with the other person, and the fact that helping other people, in a sense, helps oneself. You know, uh, you know, altruism in that sense is selfishness, and and it's fine because that the bidirectional nature of help uh, is is something that we have to understand and respect, because by that helping, I'm helping not only the person I my intention is to help, but also myself. What Which doesn't mean that I'm not going to try and look after myself. So the one of the big problems is what is called binary thinking, which is that either I do this or I do that, and the answer is I don't have to. I don't have to, fall into the trap of binary thinking. I can actually look after myself while I'm also conscious, aware, and doing something about the the larger uh, sort of domain of society. So, and in many ways, many of us would think of this as low hanging fruit, which is the obvious things. But it doesn't make them any less important. It doesn't make that fruit any less sweet. So, making sure that my sleep and appetite is maintained, making sure that I'm taking care of my health. If I'm diabetic, making sure that my sugars are maintained. If I'm hypertensive, making sure that my blood pressure is within the normal range. making sure that I'm doing a regular exercise routine. And I cannot for a moment, you know, over stress. I think that, the importance of exercise, of regular physical activity. So whether it's taking care of mental health issues or taking care of physical health issues, the importance of regular exercise is something that I think that all of society needs, perhaps, to be more aware of and more engaged with than it is. One of the biggest problems, which I think all societies have dealt with differently. In many Western societies, the lockdown was enforced, but being, you know, lifted for like 2 hours every day or some period of time every day so that people could go out and exercise. Unfortunately, in India and in Delhi, for example, the parks were shut. Uh, One could argue that this is a concern of the privileged. You know, for the person who doesn't have access to food, exercise would be a luxury, an unnecessary luxury. But for people who can, I think the importance of exercise is certainly very important, which doesn't make, which is where, what I said about binary thinking, that it we need to be aware of all that we need to do for society, and at the same time being able to and conscious about how we take care of ourselves uh, is necessary.
All right, sir. So, actually, there is a question related to that. So Rakhi says, because of this pandemic, we have become too afraid to meet people or to go out. This has badly affected our terms and social interactions. How can we overcome this?
So again, no formulaic answer, but in many ways, I think we will have to relearn these things. Yeah, we, you know, the fact that over the last year and a half, the terms of engagement, the terms of social engagement, have have changed so drastically that, in a sense, if many of us enter a room with like 12 people in it, firstly we will not even enter. Uh, and if we do, then we flinch inwardly and become anxious because we have got unused to uh, larger spaces, we've got unused to more people, and we've got unused to those social interactions. Again, the answer is not that I start organizing 1500 people weddings, but in many ways, I will have to relearn those social terms of engagement. Uh, and in many ways, I think it's going to be necessary because many things which that social engagement did in dealing with stress, in dealing with difficulties, uh, are necessary as well. Not everything about social activity or social interaction is always good. Uh, it will be like all things, which will have its advantages and disadvantages. But the fact of the matter is that to exist in the world, I am going to need to get back to social functioning. Some people will need it more than others, some people will need it less. But I think all of us will have to, in those terms, relearn those behaviors.
All right, sir. Sir, we have two more questions. So at this point, again, I would like to remind our viewers that if you do have any questions, please do feel free to drop them in now so that we can take them up. Um, so there is a question from Kamini. She says, "How can I help my child's mental health during COVID?" So you have touched upon this a little bit before, but if there's anything else that you would like to add.
So it's like that old safety belt thing, that to help the infant, I have to help myself. Before tying the infant safety belt, I have to make sure that mine is tied. If I am in a good space, if I am calm, if I am non anxious, if I am able to deal with stresses, uh, then it's a no brainer that my child will as well. I don't have to I don't have to lecture the child on dealing with stress. I have to learn how to deal with stress healthily myself, and then in many ways automatically this will happen for my child as well.
All right, sir. Sir, lastly, there is a very appropriate question again, in the sense of how can we overcome our anxieties post the pandemic? There are so many anxieties, so many stressors of multiple levels, and for every single person, I don't think I know. I don't think I know anyone who doesn't have a single stressor. That they're surrounded by. So, any way, I mean, obviously, there's no shortcut as such, but like any just, anything that you would want to leave us with in terms of any guidance?
So question begs a counter question, and the counter question is, how did I deal with the anxieties pre-pandemic? uh, so the answer is the same. The answer is that whether it's post pandemic or pre pandemic, I have to figure out how I'm going to deal with my anxieties, and my anxieties are mine. Everybody will have to find their own ways. The pandemic has created its own series of anxieties, and and that is and that's a very large domain in and of itself. It is the lockdown and the social distancing. It is the economic impact for some people. It is what is called the K-shaped. When we talk about recovery from the pandemic, economic recovery, what we talk about is what is called the K-shaped curve. That the rich will become richer and the poor will become poorer. So how do I deal with economic anxieties? How does society deal with social inequity? And the answer is not one. The answer is very many and diverse. How do I deal with those anxieties? Each person will, in the awareness of what is happening, will have to try and find the answers. And the answers, like it was earlier, will be a balance about how much I think about myself and how much I think about society as a whole. And if if anything, the pandemic is a reminder that perhaps our thinking was too much about ourselves. We were not thinking about the world or society or our ecosystem enough, which is why the pandemic happened. And if there is one thing to learn, then it is about the correcting of those balances.
All right, sir. I think you shared a lot with us today, and I think that's some that most of it will really be helpful to a lot of us. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing all of that with us. Thank you for taking out the time. Your time is precious. Thank you so much for answering all of these different questions. We're very glad that you were here. For our viewers, we do hope to see you again next Saturday. Till then, we hope that you all stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
And thank you to all those people who have listened in, and thank you to all those people who've written these questions. They were actually very interesting questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. If you have any other questions for our viewers, you can still leave us a question on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or YouTube, and we will get back to you very soon. Thank you.